Hello everyone. So this is the final video of week 4, and my apologies, the recordings this week have been a little long, and so there's a lot to material to cover, but I'll try to do my best to be more concise. In this video, I'll talk about some of the figural representations and monumental art that we have from Uruk specifically, and particularly from the Temple of Inanna that we talked about in the previous lecture, and also the invention of writing. With the urbanization, as I mentioned before, we see an explosion of this kind of new visual culture, the idea of narrative particularly, and the idea of performance kind of really comes in, especially in the context of ceremonial, these ceremonial centers with rituals and new organized rituals and rulers appearing, and so on. And sort of the invention of writing really takes place at this particular moment. We looked at this Eanna temple complex last time, where a lot of these sort of art objects, so to speak, as well as the first evidence for writing, the clay tablets, come from various buildings of the Eanna temple complex, dating from that kind of late Chalcolithic period from 3300 to 3000 BCE. So one of the really most fascinating works of art, and we're reading an article by Zainab Bahrani on this monumental piece of work of art, is the Uruk vase. We're reading Bahrani's take on the question of narrative and performativity on the Uruk vase. This is an alabaster vase that was found in the Eanna temple complex, and this actually the visual information that's included with it on the carvings, on the visual representation around the monumental vase, it tells us so much about this particular temple institution. So I wanted to sort of really get started by talking about it. It's about 41 inches long, so it's a kind of really a tall, we're talking about a really tall, beautifully carved vase in alabaster. It's a kind of a really semi-translucent material, a very refined version of marble, a rare material that we're talking about. In the bottom, there are carved around this alabaster vase are registers of representation that art historians have read from bottom to top. And so I'm going to sort of really walk you through these different bands of representation and how we read and understand them. In the bottom, on what seems to be a kind of a wavy line that you can see of water, rises a series of plants identified as flax plants and date palms. Although the identification of these different kinds of plants are still being debated. On top of that, we see alternating rams and ewes walking to our right. This three-level base with the water, plants, and animals seem to be setting some kind of a basic ordered ecology of in southern Mesopotamian mind at that time, and how that is conceptualized: the water, the plants, the animals. In the middle register, then, we depicts a row of naked and clean-shaven males with defined genitalia, they're walking to our left on the opposite direction as the animals, carrying foodstuffs and baskets and vessels, and perhaps bringing food offerings to the temple. This right and left alternation, the animals were moving towards our right, the men are moving towards our left. That actually creates this effect of spiral movement, as if they're actually following each other, right? A kind of a really dynamism. It creates a dynamism in the design. The top of the vase is partially broken and repaired in antiquity, which actually tells us that this was a very important vase, that when it was broken, they actually went into the trouble of repairing it. And so a figure, especially costumed individual on the very top with a long robe and headdress, is receiving the gifts of on top of the register via the nude man. And so if you look, so I'm showing you the entire representation here. The nude man continue and sort of present materials, these foodstuffs, to this priestess-like figure in the very center. And behind this nude figure is like a long-robed individual who is interpreted as possibly the image of a ruler or a king, a leader. And you can see the entire design that actually really works like a narrative scene, some kind of an event that is being depicted. Foodstuffs, food materials are being brought in and being given and dedicated to the temple. And the temple institution is being represented by this female figure in the very center, who's wearing some kind of headdress, and behind her are these two linear pieces that are associated then with Inanna. We will see this sign actually becoming the sign for the goddess Inanna, and behind them actually are behind them are a number of objects, more vessels, some animals, possibly showing some kind of a storeroom of the temple itself. And so here I'd like to really consider this concept of narrative. What is narrative? Narrative, visual narrative in the sense, is a convention of storytelling, right? It's a sequence of historical events that are told in pictures or text, and it becomes a record of a historical or a political event. This can be in pictorial form or in verbal form. They exist together oftentimes later in art, and we'll see some examples from Mesopotamia where they overlap. They're telling the same story both in pictures and in words. In narrative, but then we still don't have actually verbal sort of storytelling at this time, but we start to see visual storytelling, which is an important development. And in narrative, events are linked to each other in a cause-effect relationship, like in a detective novel, that are kind of really can be traced from one thing to another. Things are not like that in real life, but in a detective novel, or things are related to each other in a cause-effect relationship, and this happens in narrative as well. And we see this narrative, the idea of narrative, particularly emerging with the emergence of political elites and new states that are actually adopting visual narrative as a tool of politics, as a tool to disseminate state ideology. And I think part of it is happening here as well. Another monument at Uruk that we have, a very striking monument that we have, is the lion hunt stele. It also gives us a hint of this kind of idea of narrative here, where we see a special bearded figure, human figure with a long kilt, and possibly having a kind of a religious power. That's why the art historians are actually identifying this individual as the priest king. So we see him in two different scenes. In the first one, in the lower half, he's hunting a lion with his bow and arrow, and in the upper scene, he's the same individual is hunting a lion with his spear. The whole thing is carved on a basalt boulder and possibly served as some kind of public monument. So what's really fascinating is this is like a film, right? And this is like the same person appearing twice, and the lions appearing, and a lion hunt is taking place using different kinds of instruments. And so I'd like you to really think about what does it mean in this kind of an early context to have this kind of cinematic representation of a narrative. And this is discussed in Zainab Bahrani's book and article as well, so we will cover that on Thursday. This ruler priest, the so-called ruler priest that is identified with his special sort of hat and sort of this kind of bun, had a sort of a long articulated beard and a long robe. We see other representations of him in the form of this little statue and in this sort of cylinder seal impression that we have on the right, and I will talk about cylinder seals in a little bit. So let me talk a little bit about the writing, the invention of writing in Mesopotamia. The invention of writing emerges precisely this particular context where we're seeing sort of emergence of pictorial narrative as well from the architectural context of Eanna Temple, where they're also experimenting with architectural technologies at that time. And so early Mesopotamians used wet clay and reed stylus to write as their medium of writing. And so impressing images on when the clay is wet, symbols on this kind of damp surface of the clay, and later either baking them or drying them under the sun and leaving them under the sun or something like that. The earliest tablets from Uruk were basically lists of goods and inventories of objects. It's commonly known that that writing was invented as a tool for trade and exchange. And so what we're seeing here are basically kind of lists of items in a warehouse or something like that. And so this script that was developed over hundreds of years is known as the cuneiform script, meaning cunei means wedge-shaped, and so cuneiform is wedge-shaped because of the indentation, because of the image that is produced on the clay. The writing was not invented by a single genius at a moment of frustration, but in fact developed over a very long period of time. The earliest tablets from Uruk used a very complex system of about 900 signs, a lot of signs to remember. And these signs were very pictorial, very much like images, and made on sort of incised and drawn on clay. For example, you see here in this little chart I have on the screen, in the late Uruk period, the word head, Sumerian sag, was written with the image of a head. And then eventually, with the use of the stylus, this was actually abstracted in later periods. And you can see its development all the way to the Neo-Babylonian period. Over 2,500 years, a long process. You can see how these cuneiform signs have developed. The word ninda, which meant ration, actually was in the form of a small bowl that started in the late Uruk period, and you can see how it was eventually shaped. I want to close this session with a quick note about, but this actually. This invention actually comes with a whole set of exchange tools, and I want to sort of really clarify how writing was actually used as a tool of bureaucracy of exchange as a way of controlling exchange. And this comes with these hollow clay balls, which were used, and they were sort of really sealed with the seals of individuals, and these little tokens were put inside these bowls. So the idea is that this was an exchange item. So if you were sending 5 sheep, for example, to a distant relative, you would hand this bowl with 5 tokens in it to the shepherd, and the shepherd would deliver it without opening it, without breaking it. So that would serve as like your guarantee of how many sheep is to be delivered. So this is a kind of a tool, and this seems to be a kind of a earlier form of this particular writing as well. So I'd like to close this session with a quick note about Mesopotamian languages, which will be helpful in the coming weeks. Most widely known because of the textual archives of thousands of tablets that were sort of discovered by archaeologists belonging to these languages. The first language is Sumerian. The earliest Mesopotamian texts are associated with the language Sumerian, although we know that there were other languages that were spoken at the same time. We know this from different kinds of names and so on. Sumerian is interesting because it has no connection to other languages in the general scheme of things, no known languages, so to speak. It doesn't belong to a particular language family, but it's written in cuneiform, and it's only used up until about 2000 BC. After that, it becomes a dead language. No one on the street speaks it anymore, but it starts to become kind of an esoteric language for poetry, science, mythology, and so on. The second language is Akkadian, which actually took over from Sumerian in the 2nd millennium BCE. And in the sort of late 3rd, early 2nd millennium BCE, and it becomes the lingua franca. It's a Semitic language. It's an East Semitic language. It's an Afro-Asiatic language, and that particularly spread in the 3rd millennium. So that means that it's related to Amharic and Arabic and Hebrew, which later the other Semitic languages. With its spread in the late 3rd, early 2nd millennium, actually literacy really increased in Mesopotamia, so we're imagining that Akkadian was a lot easier to read and write in this way. So this really concludes my lecture on Uruk, and I really look forward to our discussion on Thursday. Thank you.